Hello, my dude. How you
Hello.
doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty good, mate. I'm pretty good. So, you wanted to take up the torch of the anti-natalist,
The the mantle,
the banner, the banner.
the
Right, come
banner.
on, yeah. How then?
Yeah. Yeah, all right. I should firstly say that I'm not strictly anti-natalist in the SHD sense, I would say. I'm more I think you touched upon it earlier I'm more in the Buddhist sense
Right,
because the Buddha said that the only thing I can guarantee you in life is suffering,
which I don't
and
disagree with either. I would agree there.
I don't like that prospect.
Well, I think that like obviously there's the prospect of like obviously well-being as well. So it's like it's whether the ratio is justified. So like, would you say that it's worth risking like a paper cut for I don't know like I don't know, like a to own a house. Like, would you slice your finger on a piece of paper to just have pop up in front of you like the house of your dreams, so that would like genuinely bring you a lot of comfort and safety and make you feel happy?
I would say that if I'm gonna go with that analogy, I would have to say that there's a huge chance that the finger would get infected from the paper cut.
Oh right, yes, of course. And then therefore, like when you're in the house, you would only die
You
of
would,
gangrene. Yes.
yeah, you would still suffer in the house.
Yeah, but like let's say but you suffer in the house, but like was that suffering worth the well-being that you gain from the house? It's like, yeah, there's suffering, but there's also happiness. So it's like there's a positive and there's a negative to existence. And I think that's
Hmm.
undeniable. I think that one implies the other. I think the existence of well-being implies the existence of at least not having well-being, and the existence of suffering implies the existence of not having suffering. And I would say that both are only coherent in relation to each other. That metaphysically, suffering is only possible in relation to the possibility the, of well being.
Yeah, to that I would say that uh, if there is nothing to begin with, then that would be preferable, because then we wouldn't even have an idea of suffering or joy. There would just
Why,
be nothing.
why would it be preferable if a preference, obviously, preference is built on values. So value implies conscious engagement in the world. So why would non-existence be preferable, to existence?
Because you wouldn't even know to have a value in the first place, because there wouldn't be anything to impose a value or feeling or anything else upon.
Okay, but then why, like, so for example, like, even if you didn't know it, those values, so like, you could have been born and lived a good life, or you could have been born and lived a bad life. But that doesn't mean your not being born is better than you living a good life. What justifies that distinction?
Because nothingness is a guarantee, and suffering or happiness is mutually non-guaranteeable. That's not a
Right.
word.
Okay, I see what you're
But
saying though. I get what you mean.
yeah,
So like, you're saying that essentially the risk of living a bad life is not worth the risk of living a good life, or the reward of living a
yeah.
good life, the possibility.
And I would take this to the since I'm a vegan as well, I would take this to the cow example pretty quickly, um, because I wouldn't to me it would be better if there would be no cows at all than just to have them.
Yeah, I would agree. I
Um,
mean, in terms of like animal agriculture, yeah, because then I would
mhm.
say that it's not a justifiable risk to birth a cow into a form of slavery, and I think that like obviously we're talking about real world likelihoods and probabilities. Then I think that it's more
Mhm.
probable, like if we're birthing cows to kill them, they'll likely turn out to be negative scenarios, negative consequences. Thank you very much. So like I'd make a distinction there. I'd say that like, but then I think all that shows is that one must be deliberative over whether one has a child in a given scenario.
Mhm.
Not that it's always necessarily wrong.
Um, I would agree that for anyone, maybe I would say like, perhaps 90% of people shouldn't have children, but maybe the last 10%, that would be okay because they could guarantee some sort of.
Or like it would be like a justified risk. It would. I mean, like obviously we're going to like the ratio. I think that there has to be a ratio of some people who shouldn't have kids and some people who should, and like depending on the circumstances, I actually agree with that. And that's why I would say I'm more sympathetic to the anti-natalist, because I think that the anti-natalist is usually just preaching caution a lot of the time, but then they try to make it a universal principle, and that's where they're the losers. I think that in terms of being an ethical dilemma, I think that having a child is a serious issue. It's a serious thing to consider, like whether the child is going to be happy and whether the world will be a better or worse place for it. And in terms of universal behaviors, like if everyone was to engage in this, like, you know, behave as such, behave as though your action could be made a universal law of behavior.
Right.
Bit of like Immanuel Kant. Yeah.
Kant right there.
That was Kant. Yeah. That was actually almost a direct quote.
Yeah, I think that.
But why do you think it's such a like 90% to 10%? Like, do you generally? I mean, like, do you mean that as globally, or do you mean that like in like Western Hemisphere? Because I think globally, like, unfortunately, I think given the global climate, you're probably right. I think that the way that people are like being treated today in the world is actually disgraceful, and I mean, I think that if I was in a scenario where I would be birthing my child into such poverty that they couldn't afford food to survive, and would be working a job that was so demanding of them that they may fall asleep and fall into a fucking like a machine or something, you know, like in a factory line. I'll be very dubious about like having a child in that circumstance. That's not to say that anyone's necessarily wrong. I don't think that I don't think judgment helps in this scenario. So I'm certainly not judging those people who do have children in that scenario. There's aspects of ideology, and many of them think they're doing the right thing. But I think that we could say that the risk was unjustified in terms of certain, like, you know, lived outcomes of individuals. Like, you know, birthing a child into a war zone or into slavery or something like that seems a bit unjustified to me. And the likelihood of these things happening globally is starkly high, unfortunately. But obviously, like in terms of like, you know, like someone in a developed nation who has access to basic amenities to life, whether that would necessarily be wrong. Do you know what I mean? That's a separate question.
I would probably say that both that I see this is what do you call it? An example from my life, so it might not be applicable to everyone.
Anecdotal.
Of course. Yeah, but I see a lot of people like, for example, having more than one child, which I would say is almost always a detriment.
Is it though? Because like a lot of the time we're looking for in the West, we actually have declining populations. So like, is having more than one child necessarily a detriment? Because the population's declining, and we're actually needing workers to fulfill those jobs. And then so we're pulling in large amounts of immigrants to fulfill these jobs, who are then being exploited to a greater degree as well. And then it's whether that there would be necessarily wrong for having the child anyway. I think that like, obviously it's sociopolitically complex. Like, so for example, would it be better if there was more immigrants? Would that be a better scenario? Because then you're pulling people out of abject poverty. Thank you very much for the donation, by the way, Woody. You know, and obviously the immigration benefits those individuals, but then pulling them over, you're also harming the country that they've come from. You know, now because the more educated, the most capable individuals aren't actually, you know, aren't actually like, staying in that country to improve it. So there's actually like quite like a complex scenario there going on. But could I say that someone was wrong for having two children, and increasing the population of the of that country. I don't think that's necessarily an inherent wrong.
Well, I feel like you sort of made my argument for me, and I hadn't even thought of the argument before. But it feels like you just said that Western countries should have more kids so that they could be exploited instead of the immigrant children.
No, I said like, so for example, I imagine that like, I think that it's harder to exploit Western people, to be entirely honest with you. I think that one of the reasons why immigrants are exploited is because they're immigrants. That's all I was saying. And then I was saying that, and I was also saying that it's whether those individuals would be, if they were brought over, would live better lives. And then, and like, obviously you could ask yourself these questions. I'm just saying, I was just trying to outline the complexity of the scenario.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that at all.
Okay.
But I think that especially in a capitalist system, exploitation is, as you would say, also as
inevitable,
well, I guess,
almost. Yeah. I would agree. But then it's whether, if in this developing nation, if those of us who have, let's say, socialist values, who understand it to be a form of exploitation, don't have children, but then and so like the generations of like the families from which individuals would have children, like, we can try and educate, don't get me wrong, but in terms of having socialist families, making it normal within society, I think would also diminish. So like the numbers of socialists may diminish, the numbers of and those people who are trying to reform society to be better would also diminish. So even if your child does get exploited, and I think in a Western hemisphere, I think it could still be justifiable, like for life. Like you can have a life where you're exploited and it still be a life worth living. Do you know what I mean? Like it's just the same as suffering. I think that in terms of whether that we should always try to bring that exploitation to an end. Like, don't get me wrong, politically. And I think that like maybe we can help do that in the sense that when we're educating our children, I think that obviously I think education on a societal level needs to take place as well, not just on like you educate your kids to be socialist, that's fair enough, but then obviously you've got to have conversations amongst each other. So I don't know whether it would necessarily, I don't think that it necessarily proves antinatalism anyway. If your children are going to be exploited, it's whether they're going to be exploited to such a degree where it's unjustifiable, and whether that it would perpetuate a change in circumstances anyway if those individuals use their political power, which may be greater, being Western citizens, to change the global political climate.
Mm-hmm. I think that there is a difficulty in establishing what a life worth living is. Maybe now more than ever, since like people take more antidepressants than ever. Like kids are
True. I think that a purposeful life, and I think that's one of the things that we need to really hammer home. I think that one of the things that's happening with society is it's actually getting worse and worse, and I don't think people realize that. I think that they see the material outcomes and they think it's getting better and better, but then the way in which people are engaging with the material is forcing a psychological deterioration within the group of people who have more and more. So it's like, yeah, the lower classes might have more than they've ever had. They also might be unhappier than they've ever been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be my point.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point. I think that, and I've actually made this point like together, like with loads of antinatalists, and I said like, look, I think I would have to have like be okay with birthing an individual into a certain culture as well. And this culture I find at the minute to be questionable, to say the least. Like, will this scenario lead to an okay child, like an okay scenario for my child? Am I okay with them living this life? But also, like, is there possibility of it getting better? Would the existence of the child be an overall greater good? Am I respecting them if I'm using them as a means to an end for political change? You know what I mean? These things are what need to be questioned. And I think I don't think birthing a child for purely for political reasons is a good justification. I think that birthing them into a scenario where they could have a good life is fair enough. And I think that we just need to, approach it with a level of respect. What's the likelihood of this child living a good life? What's the likelihood of this child living a bad life? What's the likelihood of the politic continuing the way it is? What's the likelihood of, it getting worse? And these are the things that we have to engage with in terms of risk. But then I don't think this is antinatalism. I think that this is just ethics. Just the ethics of whether you should or should not have a child, depending upon the scenario. What are your duties and obligations?
I guess that I think that I sort of see those two things as sort of the same thing.
I think a lot of antinatalists I've talked to have, and then they've kind of like, for example, with Seven of Swords, I think he was saying like, right, I see what you're saying. Like, it's a universal principle rather than just like a normal ethical dilemma. It's like veganism's like a universal principle in terms of, don't use sentient beings as a means to an end, I would say. And I think it's the same thing with antinatalism. I think it perpetuates a universal principle that it is always wrong to have children, not that it is wrong in a given scenario, which is why you have arguments like the consent argument, which is like you are doing something which violates the consent of another. They could not consent to be born. Or I'm trying to think of another one. Or like arguments about positive and negative ethics, like whether it's always wrong to perpetuate something like existence. Or I'm trying to think of like of another one again, like or even in terms of suffering, like humans are born to suffer to a greater degree than they have well-being. Like all of these seem to be perpetuating like norms, like universal norms.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I would agree, I think we agree pretty much that it is a profound ethical problem whether we should have children or not. It's whether it's a universal principle that can be applied and whether it should be applied that I think is the point of contention.
Yeah, maybe it would be more appropriate to say like a sort of agnostic form of antinatalism.
I think even just ask the question, like, is it like I think the real problem is that so many people go through life thinking that it's always justified for people to have kids, or that it's like because it's a right that you can have a kid, that it means that you ought to have a kid. And these things are what needs questioned. It's like, just because you can doesn't mean you should. It's nope. and I think that's like normally what people don't get. Like, so when you say like, maybe you shouldn't have kids, you're not saying to them like, it's not a form of eugenics or a form of like, a form of or anything that would be unethical. In fact, what you're saying is like, look, I care about your future child, and I know you do too. Do you think that this is a scenario that would be good for them? Do you think the outcome's justifiable in relation to them? Have you considered that? Is this for you? Is it for them? Is it for society? Because if it's not for them, then can you say that it's a good thing? And I think that that's really where we need to take the conversation. Just getting people to question in the first place.
Yeah, because the way I see it is that I don't how would you say? I don't unilaterally like condone like or no
condemn
promote
okay
promote sort of human life as I don't see life itself as a virtue, I guess I would say. So I don't think there's a value in putting another life on the planet. In and of itself, that is. So just like celebrating giving birth and having new people on the planet doesn't necessarily add anything to the planet, I would say. And this would go for me too.
Well, I mean, it could, and it's obviously their life as well. It's like whether their life was good or not. And I mean, like, look, like the good, like, so for example, a good life adds something to the planet, and it adds something to that individual, which is the foundation of the reality. Like, the value has increased if someone's lived a good life. The narrative that perpetuates the world, like what we class as what is good or not, has been improved. Like, the overall outcome has increased. And so that, like, I think that, like, it can be. I think that there is no need necessarily for life. Like, as you say, just because someone's born doesn't make it a good thing. In fact, it could be a bad thing. It's like, if you're born, like, I think one of the contentionable things is, like, is it okay to birth a child to use as a bone marrow donor for another child? you know? And there's, like, been films made about this, and it's like, that's a very contentious point. It's like, are you using that child? Are you putting that child through a great deal of suffering? Is that a life that's worth, like, living for that child? But then obviously you can ask it in a greater degree. I mean, at least that child has a life that may be, like, purposeful and fulfilling, where they go, like, oh yeah, I'm feeling this pain, but this pain and the pain of my existence is justified because there is a direct good in relation to that individual. So maybe that person lives a happier life than maybe a lot of people that today, even the rich and the famous, like, who many times even end up killing themselves because they feel purposeless. They feel empty and hollow, and they need something to give them a sense of meaning and fill this, like, hole, this void in them. And I think that, like, that's filled, that you fill that with ethics, like, more than anything. I think that it's community and engaging with others, purpose. And I think that having a child into a scenario where they, and you teach them, to live a hedonistic life, may be worse in many ways than having a child that's given a great deal of physical burden, but then has purpose to it. And I think that we don't even talk about these things. But I think you're absolutely right in saying that when we talk about existence being a positive, I think many people just assume it's a positive. I guess my point is that both the pro-natalist and the anti-natalist are wrong. That you cannot assume that existence is either a positive or a negative.
Mm. So you would be natalist agnostic as well.
Yeah, I would say that, like, yeah, exactly. Like, it's in the sense that we cannot have knowledge of whether existence is good or bad. We can only have existence. We can only have value, past the point of existence. But I think that's the same thing with anything. I think, in terms of, I make this claim about determinism all the time. Like, we can't have a causal theory of mind, for that very reason, that you cannot know something that precedes existence.
Yeah.
I think we kind of agree more than anything.
Yeah, me too. Like I wrote to you before, I'm not necessarily, like, a pure anti-natalist. It's just that I can see that point of the argument more than because the other side I can see, like, it's basically your purpose in life to breed.
Yeah, I think the pro-natalist is the harder position to argue anyway. And I think that it's also, like, probably the least moral, because it's like, all right, we'll just have a kid no matter the circumstances. Birth kids, and it's all you're meant to do. Just birth kids, and they're meant to birth kids, and everyone's meant to birth kids no matter what happens. And I think that's the stupidest thing. Like, go forth and multiply. It's like, no, don't do that. Like, please stop. We're multiplying too fast now, please. Like, and there's a time when that makes sense. Like, maybe the outcomes, like, maybe it's okay to, like, multiply a great deal of positives. It's like, oh yeah, this is great. Everyone's having a great time. That's everyone else. Let's make more people having a great time. But then if you start having so many people that everyone starts having a worse time, it's like, well, stop having people, And I think that is, like, an argument that needs to be made.